Hi, how are you doing, Annabelle?
Live on Facebook. Talk to Facebook friends.
Live, huh? Okay. I'm here covering the Republican side of the race for Rolling Stone. So this is a piece that's going to come out in a couple of weeks, probably, in the magazine. And it's mostly about Trump and whether or not he wins here, and what the prognosis is going forward for that race. I think, my early take on this is that things are coalescing in kind of a perfect way for Trump to not only win the nomination, but maybe win the whole thing. On the Democratic side, we have Bernie and Hillary blooding each other, which is going to hurt either one of them if either one becomes the candidate. And then on the Republican side, his success really depends upon whether or not key figures drop out in that race. So if he has to run against just one or two people, he's going to have a harder time. But if more of them stay in the race longer, that increases his chances. And so every time you have somebody who has momentum who slips, like Rubio, Rubio did well after Iowa, but he's done poorly here, which may lift somebody like Christie a little bit higher and cause him to stay in the race longer. That ends up favoring Trump because his support is insoluble. It's not going to go anywhere, whereas all the rest of these people, if they can't bounce each other out of the race fast enough, then that's going to leave Trump with a plurality of the votes and probably the nomination. So that's kind of my early take on the whole thing.
Do you have a personal, how do you feel about it, just at a gut level? Like
About Trump?
What does it mean for you?
I think it's a dangerous pseudo-authoritarian movement. It's interesting in a lot of ways. I think this is something that Bernie fans are not going to want to hear very much, but I think there are parallels actually between what's going on with Trump and what's going on with Bernie. And what I mean by that is not that they have anything in common politically, but in both cases what we're seeing is widespread rejection by the voters of the party establishment. And I think a lot of the intensity of the feeling for Bernie is largely rooted in the fact that the quote-unquote presumptive frontrunner is so clearly a party insider and represents so plainly what the DNC has been all about for a generation now. Whereas on the Trump side, it's really the same thing. If you talk to people at Trump rallies, what they're most angry about is this sense that they've been lied to by the Republican Party establishment, and that's driving a lot of the enthusiasm behind him. They feel like Trump is telling the truth, that he's not lying to them, and they've been lied to a lot. And so, even though they have nothing to do with each other politically, I think there's a similar thing going on. Also, there's another thing is neither candidate is drawing upon the traditional fundraising sources. Normally in order to win the nomination for either party, you just got to hit those big donors, and Trump really isn't doing that. He's mostly self-funding, and Bernie isn't doing that either. He's kind of going more the Howard Dean route, which is individual small donors bypassing the big donors, and that allows them a lot more independence of thought, even though in Trump's case it's bad thought, but it's still independent thought.
Yeah, so they're both going against people like Koch brothers and other big donors, and corruption between the big donors and the Republican Party.
Right.
And how about the media part? They've both been critical of mainstream media.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. So typically the way presidential elections work is that there's this nexus of media and big donors and party establishment, and whenever those three groups coalesce around any candidate, that's when you get a front runner. When there's a candidate who steps outside the acceptable parameters of opinion, then typically you'll get the media beating up on that candidate, like Howard Dean's a classic example of somebody who got fairly regular abuse by quote-unquote mainstream media, and I was there. I covered those campaigns, and Bernie Bernie falls in line with that pattern. The bulk of the people covering his campaign are sending signals that it's not serious, that it's something to that it's a novelty campaign, that he's on the fringes, and this is a way of telling voters that they don't really have permission to vote for this candidate as a serious candidate. Trump had the same treatment, except that he just steamrolled right over that, and I think that's part of the reason the media treatment of Trump has been so vitriolic since he announces that he's kind of defied conventional wisdom and stayed in the race, even though we tried to sink him right away.
But they're benefiting from it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Being seen as the candidate that the media doesn't like has turned out to be a huge boon this time around. And being seen as the candidate that the party establishment doesn't like similarly is just as important. I mean, it helped Carson for a while. It's helping Ted Cruz to an extent. But it's certainly helping all those candidates.
Ironic. Being anti-TV is good TV.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Trump has capitalized on it much better. He's gotten a lot more press attention out of that than Bernie has. But I think Bernie has accrued just as much real support out of that. So. Yeah.
Now, question is, everyone is selling a story.
Mm-hmm.
All the candidates, are selling a story.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to hear your description of the story Bernie's selling.
No, Bernie's story has been consistent ever since that he's been a politician. I think his platform is basically the most important part of his platform is that the economic system in this country, the political economic system, is organized in such a way that the ordinary person is disenfranchised. And that something needs to be done to correct that problem. I think the 2008 crash is kind of an important parable in the Bernie Sanders view of the world, that this was evidence of what happens when we let this system of unchecked greed and paid for political opinion run rampant. And I think that's his message, that most of what goes on in Washington is not independent political thought, but it's paid for by big industry and more particularly by big finance. I think that's a major part of his problem, and that's what he's running on. And he's trying. I think what's interesting about it is he's trying to also explain those phenomena as well, which is something you don't often see in political campaigns. The sort of educational aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been actually saying that his rallies are like teach-ins.
Right.
Yeah, and it does raise people's consciousness, and I think they commit at a much deeper level to the process when they realize what the truth is.
Right.
And it's not just like vote for me.
Right.
But he's trying to sell democracy.
Right, and that's one of the things that's been so frustrating about politics in previous campaigns, is that you have people who have been U.S. senators, governors, congressmen, congresspeople, and they've been in there. They've been in these meetings. They've been in committee hearings. They know how laws get made. They know how things get done. They know how the money game works, and they don't stand up there and explain that to the voters. What they do is they come up with pre-rehearsed, dial-surveyed lines that they think are going to go over about the flag and protecting the troops or whatever it is, and they don't trust people to make informed decisions. They don't want to do that teaching thing. Whereas I think it's very important for Bernie's campaign. He wants people to understand what the dynamic is, and he wants people to know what he's talking about. And I imagine that his campaign started off mainly as an educational gambit, that he wanted to use the platform to teach people what was going on. It just sort of happened that he ended up being seriously a contender. So.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I'm guessing. I don't know. I never talked to him about it, but.
Well, I want to ask you about this idea of revolution, because I do take it seriously, and I've been thinking a lot about it, even before Bernie ran. I mean, just like, what is it going to take? What kind of disruption will it take for us to get back on course? And I'm dying to hear what you think of that language that he's using, And because I don't, socialism, I feel we've talked to death about socialism, but the word revolution to me is actually potentially a scarier word.
Right.
So what do you think about it?
Well, I think it's a bit of a contradiction in terms, because I don't think you can really have a revolution that comes from a legally, a legal electoral process. I think by definition, revolution means overthrowing the current process. So unless you're using the electoral process to subvert later on the current form of the state, like say the Nazis did in the 30s, and that would be the model that I would worry about with Trump, for instance, right? He's gonna end up being legally elected, and then he might decide not to follow this or that law and to change the rules midstream. You know what Nixon did, arguably, that you could construe that as a revolution, because he gets legally elected and then decides that he's going to change the rules of the game and use the power of the presidency to try to rig it in his favor. I don't know that what Bernie's doing is really a revolution. I think it's a marketing term, really, in his.
Well, I mean, if you think about it at a technical level, revolution is upheaval, disruption. And I think what is revolting against is big money and how that's actually corrupted our process.
Sure. I just think the technical definition of a revolution would be something a little bit more extreme than what he's doing.
Right. But if
he's not Trotsky.
Right. But if we get rid of big money, if we get rid of the role of big money, that would be a huge change, right?
Yeah, it would be. No question that it would be a big change. Would it be a revolution? I don't know. I mean, colloquially, it might be. You might call it a revolution, maybe.
Okay.
But,
I mean, so tell me what you would like to see happen. Let's say it's wildly successful, and Bernie succeeds beyond his wildest dreams.
Yeah.
What would you like to see happen as the outcome?
Well, I mean, it's kind of not really my job as a reporter to get into the business of what I would like to see happen. I mean, I'm happy to talk about what I think is happening, but I don't. Even though I have great affection for Bernie, and I think it's pretty obvious how I feel about him from the articles that I've written about him, I'm not going to get in the business of saying that I want him to win versus anybody else. So.
Okay, no, that's fine. Yeah. So, what is a potential big change that you could see happening?
Well, Bernie winning or Trump winning, either one of those things would have an enormous impact in terms of changing the way we go about choosing presidential candidates, because we've had this very entrenched, difficult to change process for generations about how we choose our candidates, and now we've blown away that organizational structure on both sides this time around. The idea of having candidacies that appeal directly to people, I think the internet's played a big role in this. People, have been able to bypass the commercial media. They've been able to bypass the traditional funding sources by using the internet to directly support candidates and to directly get their own news sources. It's a huge change, but I suspect that it will only happen one time. I think big money will find a way to reassert itself. If there's a blip in the radar this time and accidentally a candidate gets through, I think that they'll find a way to clamp down and make sure it doesn't happen again.
I mean, you've written so much about kind of almost going into the detail, like the diagnosing things that are going wrong, right, in our country.
Yeah. Right.
Like, if you could sort of summarize, like, what you think is sort of at the root of this.
Well, money in politics is an enormous factor. If we could actually change that would. I mean, just to take an example, look at what happened after 2008, where we had this obvious, urgent national crisis. What do we do about the financial markets? They're clearly corrupted. We needed to go in there and make a few major but simple rules changes. So, sort of like what we did after the Great Depression. We went in and Roosevelt instituted regulated exchanges, instituted rules for publicly traded companies. It's a few things, but they were important big changes. we had a clear path to do that this time around. We had obvious solutions that we should have done, but we couldn't do it because the major source of funding in both Congress and the Senate comes from the financial services sector. So we ended up with this thing that looked like reform, that had a reformy name to it, you know, the Dodd-Frank Act, but it really wasn't anything important. And so I think a major change would be to find a new way to publicly funded elections would be a huge thing that I would be in favor of.
Do you feel like the Wall Street has captured our federal government?
I think it's significantly captured the regulatory structure. I think an enormous number of the candidates are dependent upon money from the financial services sector, because I think I saw some stat with something like 41% of all fundraising donations come from the financial industries, and like insurance, Wall Street, the law firms that represent those companies. So that if you need a lot of cash quickly, that's the business, that's the area that you go to. And a lot of candidates are very, very dependent upon that money. In particular, the candidates who come from like the tri-state area, who wield a lot of power in Congress. So yeah, I mean, that's a major thing to get over, but and I would imagine that would be something that Bernie would do something about it if he ever got elected president. But also, you know, as we're seeing in this race, the big money may not win the day in actual elections. It can definitely win the day in congressional votes, because it's easy for donors to apply pressure to people who are already in office, but they can't directly affect voters, and that's one of the things that this is a flaw in the system, is that they you know, you can't have somebody from Citigroup or from JP Morgan Chase call 1 million voters and tell them they got to change their vote. It doesn't work that way. The voters will vote the way they want to vote, and that's what's kind of cool about this whole thing.
Yeah. So there is that last remaining hope for us, that the people will have that awakening and vote without being influenced by the big ads that are paid for by big money.
Right.
And that we will actually maybe use the internet to free ourselves from that kind of propaganda and influence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, so one last thing I want to ask you is, just, you know, this is kind of personal talk. Are you feeling hopeful right now about our future, or are you still kind of disgusted and cynical about it?
I'm not going to lie to you. I find the Trump thing really upsetting. I worry a lot about, you know, I have kids now, and you know, some of the things that you see. We've been mining this sort of politics of resentment and anger and hate for a long time, and the political media has been fueling this politics of divisiveness for a long time. And it was a means to an end to get people elected for a while, but now it's taken on a life of its own. It's like a Frankenstein's monster. And I worry that it's pushed past the point of no return, and we've created something really ugly that could, you know, could alter the history of this country. I mean, I used to cover this stuff with a sense of humor, and I used to think it was more funny than anything else, grotesque but funny. Now I'm actually worried about it, you know, which I never really was before. So.
Worried since Trump?
Yeah, I think the Trump thing, you know, added to the Cruz maybe thing, but the Trump thing especially worries me, because the intensity of the anger, the discontent. There's a race, you know, factor there that is upsetting and undeniable. And you know, we used to have dog whistle politics, and now it's not dog whistling. Now it's out in the open. You know, the racial grievance factor. I think it can't end well. I don't think it's a good thing. You know, I think the divisiveness and the anger problem is just worse than ever, and I worry about it. You know. from. It's such a cliche, but I worry about it for my kids.
What would help you to not worry about it? What would have to happen for you to say, okay, you've dealt with that?
I don't know. I can't imagine that. Honestly, I think we've. The one thing that I do think is that when people stop watching television, when they stop consuming political media, and they just sort of spend time with each other, Americans tend to be pretty reasonable if they actually meet each other and talk to each other. But when they're intensely focused on watching the news, they get worked up about things, and they hate each other more. And so if we could find a way to not be so driven by the things that we read and the things that we see on TV, I think for the most part Americans are pretty reasonable. That the economic situation is not so bad in this country that it's like bloodlust and anger and hatred that comes from a place of true desperation. I don't think we're there yet. I think it's really media created hostility for the most part. And so if we could find a way to turn it off, it's like the Book of Mormon song, "Turn It Off." If we could just turn off the TV and not be so influenced by all that stuff, I think that would help. Maybe. I don't know.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Annabelle.